All right. Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. This is the special meeting of the BET for August 2010. There is one item on our 2011. I'm even off a year. There's one item on our agenda, ED1, listing the MISA Building Committee, and at the time of the agenda, we still didn't have a number, so the official agenda has a bunch of X's where a dollar amount would be, and it would be a release of conditions. So I don't really see who's behind the placard, but let me turn this over to Joe Ross, who's chairman of the Building Committee. And before, go ahead. You can take the microphone and just make sure it's on. I will say that obviously there's been a flurry of conversation since about last Thursday or Friday, and it was requested that the BET take up this item because of the need for additional sums. As I've indicated before to the media, and then I'll say again tonight, the reason we're here is because of the condition that the BET placed on the appropriation originally, which obviously we didn't anticipate this to be the issue, but it's certainly one of the reasons why, as a result of the conversations regarding the overall cost of the project, that the BET thought it wise to place the release of the condition on the appropriation so that we can have a thorough review as the process moves along. So that's one of the predominant reasons why we're here tonight, and the reason why the Building Committee needs to request the release of the conditions, although the money was previously appropriated out of the 11-12 budget. So with that, Joe Ross, chairman of the Building Committee.
Use this portable microphone. Is this one here?
No, it's the one that's on, and you can pull that out if you need to walk around.
Okay. How's that? Yeah, it's good. It's okay? I just wanted to review a little bit of what we were doing out at the job site. I think that helps put it all into perspective. And this is a plan. Leslie, can you see it from there? You okay? All right.
We can slide down if you want.
This is a plan of the existing school. This is the existing main part of the school. This is the science wing over here, and this is part of the pool and the facilities, the gym, all in this area. So the gray areas that you see here are the existing. The MISA project was to add two major additions. One is the auditorium, which is in the intersection of the science wing and the gymnasium that's in this area, and also to demolish the existing facilities that are out in front here. It's mostly the existing auditorium, and at that point in time, enlarge the music instructional spaces here. To do that, what we found was that when we do this construction, it's going to displace a lot of the existing parking. So there was a permanent requirement to be parking neutral on the job, so we had to find replacement areas for all of this parking. And that's in the permanent solution, and also in a temporary solution, in that when we do this and we go through the school years, we would want to have more parking, or nearly the same amount of parking that we previously had. So the solution to that was to expand the existing parking 18 feet back, and this is north this way, okay, so 18 feet to the west, to also take down a lot of the rock and the existing area that's over here on the north side, and also a substantial increase on the south side. This is where the Black Box Theater is. So a combination of those things, as well as some realignment in the traffic pattern, realignment in the special ed bus loading areas, were part of the permanent project. What we wanted to do is to do this as an early phase, okay, so that when we started this, we had the parking, but also to do it during the summer because that's the best time to do it. We have less people on the site. We do have some summer school. We did have some use of the fields, but it was much less usage and much less trafficked as far as being able to efficiently build that part of it. So we came to you, and you okayed $1.8 million, which is essentially for all of these gray areas that you see here. And it includes expanding parking, it includes putting in drainage, it includes some site work. It didn't include this part here because we were going to do that much later, so we left that alone. We started the project right after we bid it and awarded it and came to you for appropriations I guess it was July 1st. And we started the project because we only had 8-9 weeks to do it in all areas simultaneously. That's what we bought from the contractor. So if you went out there on July 1, or even if you go out there today, you will see a lot of machines and blasting and grading going on here. You will see a lot of activity here, and we're almost finished on this side. And you would have seen a lot of activity here, but what you're seeing there now is that we have excavated some of this area. We have now cordoned it off with security fencing, and you'll see two big piles of materials that are tarped over. The reason being is a couple weeks ago, we had, as we excavated in this west area, we noticed a black layer in the excavation of a large trench that we were doing in this back area and in some of the excavated areas. Now, we took 18 foot of the existing grass area as part of our expansion, and that's where we're finding most of the problem. We haven't gone under the parking areas, this area, too much, but between the edge of where it was before, there used to be a wood guardrail and barrier in the back, and 18 feet to the west, that's this way, that's where we started our excavation. It happened to be the lowest point for our drainage, is where we wanted to start, this part. When we saw the layer, we went to a on-call environmental consultant, and the environmental consultant said, this does look a little suspicious, but I need a few days to run the tests. So we took a series of samples in the back here. By then, we had already excavated a lot of this material and had piled it up, because that's what you do. You excavate the material, do the trenches, do the grading, and then put the material back. That was the intent. So once we had an indicator from the testing lab that there was various metals, there was various contaminants, there was PCBs, which is our biggest concern, in those piles, and in this trench, we immediately stopped, covered the pile. We also took some quick samples here, and those were all clean. So subsequently, we have continued here, and we've continued here, but we've stopped here. When we did that, then we reported to the Board of Ed saying this is what we found, and they were concerned, and I'll let Sid address it, that, okay, what do we know about this? We have summer school going on. We have people using the fields. What do we need to be concerned about? So we also had an environmentalist come in and do air quality tests, and he also did some swipe tests inside the building, just to see if there was anything in the air or that had entered into the building systems. And the answer to those tests have been no. So we're not getting any air pollution or any interior contamination from any of the operations. So we've stopped here, we continue here and here. At some point in time, as this problem became more known to the state and the federal EPA, they asked for reports, and we're in the middle of dealing with them at this point in time. The state DEP has certain regulations about levels of PCBs, levels of metals, etc. The federal EPA person who's looking at this is based in Boston, and she has been in conference calls, in not direct meetings, but conference calls, and has been receiving submissions. As part of the program, what was suggested was that we stopped here, but the Board of Ed would like to know, and so would the EPA and other people, that is there any other areas on the fields that may be in contention? This is field number 1, which is the football field. This is field number 2, which is the baseball field. 3 and 4 are the soccer fields. 5 is the softball field. I guess I can't call it softball, I'll call it baseball field. 6 and 7 are the other fields over here. And all of these fields, except for the baseball fields, are covered in artificial turf. Now, the perimeters of them have grass areas around them and have ability for testing, a testing program around the fields. And that has been authorized or directed by the Board of Ed, and we're in the middle. And if you go out there now, you'll see a bunch of orange flags that indicate where tests are being taken around the site to determine whether or not there's anything that we should be worried about in the fields. Now, I'm using we, even though I'm the building committee. A lot of this is not within our scope of work or our purview. Our contract limit line is here. But because we had dug this up and started the testing program, we felt we were the best ones equipped to keep going with the testing and to understand what was going on. It is not part of our job as far as your funding or anything else outside here. I'm not sure whose it is, whether it's Board of Ed or Parks and Rec. But we felt that to get a quick turnaround and to get a quick evaluation, we took it upon ourselves and the Board of Ed to institute this. And we did that because we're all under the constraint that we want to get the fields back in operation by the 3rd week in August, and we want to get the kids back in school by the last week in August. So we're trying to determine what's out there. We're trying to determine how we can get rid of the piles that are here and backfill and encapsulate this area. And we're also, at the same time, interested in continuing and finishing the areas that are outside of the area in question. So that's really the background of where we started, and that's how we got where we are. We have various consultants. We have EAS Consulting, who was on staff with the Board of Ed that did the air monitoring and the initial tests. We have DTC, which is an environmental firm, and a civil engineering firm from Hamden, Connecticut, that are doing the tests around the fields, plus they're helping us in evaluating the soils that are in those piles. We're competitively bidding the removal of those contaminated soils. By tomorrow, we'll have 3 prices. We're getting 1 price from the contractor that's on the job, who is licensed to do that removal, and we have 2 other prices from other firms that specialize just in the removal of contaminated materials. So what we are looking for is to quickly finish where we can and quickly encapsulate and backfill and get rid of the piles that we have. We may end up with some security fencing in this area to leave it. That may be one of the EPA's requirements, saying even though you've backfilled it, we don't want anybody on it. It's possible. And we're also looking at the protocols of the testing. There was a meeting this morning with the federal EPA people and the state and our groups, Board of Ed and our consultants, about the tests that are going on in the field and preliminarily when they would have the studies and the reports. So it's ongoing. Nobody can tell yet where we have problems. I know I have a problem right here because in this 18 feet, I've dug it up, and it's better than a test. You can actually go out there and sample it, and that's what they have been doing. And the concern here is high PCBs in this area. So that's where we are. And where we go from now is to try to get rid of these piles, and it's very expensive, and we've put together an estimate on what we have to do. We've incurred some costs already in covering these piles. We have an ongoing testing program, again, that we're doing right now under the MISA people because we felt that we're the best people to do it immediately. We got people out in the job site. We've got the machines. We've got everything we need, but really probably is not a MISA issue as far as any dollars or cents, but in trying to get this done in the next 3 weeks, we thought it was the quickest way. We also thought it was the quickest way to get funding of ongoing testing and removal. Again, nothing was in our original budgets, nothing was in our original plans as far as high PCB contents, and certainly nothing was in our plans about testing all of the fields. We put together an estimate that we had sent to you We gave you two charts. One was a chart of what we thought it would take to stop the job in the back and to have the materials trucked off. The second chart we gave you was just a reconciliation of where we were on the original 1.8 million. And the 1.8 million, we're pretty close. We have a little bit of that contingency left, but not much. And so therefore we have no dollars left to do any of this other work that we're doing. We've started to incur costs on testing. We've started to incur costs on piling this stuff and cover them. And we need to cover those costs. I have some money in other budgets, little stuff, but nowhere near these dollars. So I'm not incurring anything that you haven't approved yet. But what I really need is the dollars to get rid of this and to encapsulate this and to go on our way.
Okay, thank you. So having had discussed this and various telephone conversations and then various emails and the like, I think we should try to structure this meeting. And I know several of you have commitments beyond this meeting, and it was noticed on. It wasn't short notice. We have a requisite 24 hours, but certainly I think on 2 days' notice. So first of all, I appreciate everyone who can attend, and we have, I think, great attendance for such short notice of a meeting in August. But why don't we first just go through the numbers, and then we can. There are some other topics that I know are important to members up here just because of the conversations and emails that I've seen. So if you could, if anybody has any questions from this body as to the actual numbers that are being used, a lot of what we received, quite frankly, was from the newspaper reporting or any of the media reporting on this. And so your numbers, I think, need to be further explained in light of the fact that there are 3 piles of dirt, and if you can go through that and talk about the cross-contamination, why we're there. I mean, you've heard, I'm sure, the same public conversation that we're hearing. Was that necessary that there was cross-contamination? Are we now paying dearly for that? And if you can sort of walk through that page 1 of your construction cost impacts and talk a little bit about the same things you've heard from whether it's the public or others around.
Sure. When we stopped the operation in the back, we essentially had 3 piles. We had Pile A, which was fill, roots, a whole bunch of other stuff that was there. We had Pile B, which was the soil that came out of the trench that was all the ways in the back there, that we definitely knew was contaminated. And we had Pile C, which is the largest pile, that was fill but mostly topsoil. On a site work job, it's not unusual that you take the topsoil, because it's a valuable commodity, and you stockpile it. So you scrape off the topsoil in the back area, you scrape off the topsoil wherever you have topsoil, but predominantly was in the west area, and you keep it for when you're finishing the project, and then you spread it back out. What we were surprised is that we were getting readings of PCBs in the topsoil, which is unusual. And that triggered us to say, okay, stop mixing any further topsoil and segregate. Don't take any more topsoil from any other parts of the job site and put it into that pile. The mitigation we tried to do is we tried to then mix, what we wanted to do is mix high concentrated soil with less concentrated soil, because that would bring the level of PCBs down, which would allow you to go to a more economical transfer station or dump site. That's not allowed. We've done that with lead. We've done that with petrochemicals. It's not allowed in the state of Connecticut with PCBs. So we cannot reduce our exposure, because we have been told by both the state and the federal that PCBs are not a dilutable, if that's a word, chemical, and that as soon as it appears, that's what you're going to do. However, there's 2 levels of PCBs. There's above 50 and below 50. I think that's the right number. So then what we tried to do is say, well, we know that Pile B had readings that were higher than the 50. So we're pretty much acknowledged that we're going to have to pay the higher tonnage to price to remove it. Pile C, which is the topsoil, we felt that we could try to segregate some areas out where it was clean topsoil and where it wasn't. And we received notification from the state that that would not be acceptable. That once PCB is in that mix, that they're not going to allow us to retest, because it's much more economical to take pile C apart and monitor it. I could take the first 100 tons and monitor it. If that's not it, then let me take it off. Take the second 100 tons. If that is okay, then that's got to go to the dump site. So we asked that, and the answer from both the state and the federal government was no, you can't do it. However, they would allow us to show them that maybe that pile is less than the 50, and therefore I could save some money by going to the not to a clean dump site, but to a less regulated dump site. So we've been looking at both of those things.
So just to point on this, you are under your 1E as an elephant, and I guess D, you are saying that to remove essentially all three piles, we're in excess of $700,000.
Yes, pile A was removed because it was clean. We went through, and because it hadn't been touched by the topsoil or the other trench, it had roots in it, so therefore the contractor wasn't going to use it for backfill. He had segregated that. We quickly tested that. That's been taken off the site. So what's remaining is pile B, which is item D, and pile C, which is item E. And those are the ones we were trying to get relief on from the state, especially on the topsoil, about taking that off. Let us check it again. Let us segregate it. And the answer is no. With PCBs, you can't. The first two items, A and B, are the testing. In other words, the soil samples and the monitoring is a budget for the testing. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I'm just trying to sort of recreate the conversation, the questions that I've heard, and then I'll open it up. And I think these are some of the more basic questions that are being asked. So the soil samples and air monitoring, that's solely related to MESA as opposed to the fields, or does that include the testing that you described for going beyond the 18 feet?
It has both. But at this point in time, we just had to get the piles removed from the MESA site. We had to, the concern from the EPA and the state was, how widespread is this? And so therefore we used the same consultants. At some point in time, there could be a reconciliation of what tests were outside the MESA lot line or limit line or whatever, but at this point in time, we're just going. Now, since the conversation today, also, item B, where we put in a budget of $100,000, we were advised by the state that they might want to significantly increase that testing. What that testing is, so you understand, is when you go out into the fields, is you dig down from the top of the grass down to 12 inches. And you take that sample, that column of soil, and you sort of mix it together, you put it in a glass jar, and you go to a testing lab. And therefore, that represents an average of the top 12 inches of what's underneath or adjacent to the fields, etc., which is a standard test that our consultants in the state has used before. We were advised today, and I wasn't at the meeting, but Sid was at the meeting, that they are now concerned in the top 3 inches, in the top 6 inches, and they may want us to go back and to take segregated soil in the top 3 inches and the top 6 inches, because they think in our mixing, the 12-inch column, that we may be diluting the PCBs, and they're not going to allow us to do that. So this whole question of the testing budget was affected by today's conversation, and we seem not to be able to convince the state or the federal EPA that there's reasons to look at averages. They're not looking at averages now. They're being very hard-nosed as far as no, I want specific tests and specific layers, and I want these piles all off the job, either at this higher 50 level, or convince me that you can use a blend of it. And we're not having any luck convincing them that there's a blend.
So assuming that that's the case, what does that $100,000 become?
I don't know. Because if they had me duplicate every test, this is 156 of one test and 140 of another test. I forgot.
43 is the number we were told today on the sampling that they're going to be
Of the additional? Right. It could double it. I don't know. I just don't know. And now the EPA and the state have not given us a direction on this, but this came up at today's meeting, which happened about 2 o'clock or 11:30 this morning.
So if I go down this list, right, we have soil samples and air monitoring. You've described what that is. Environmental phase 2 and 3, we've just talked about that.
Right.
Segregate, stockpile, cover materials, and fence, you've described that. We've talked about the removal of the contaminated soil in D and E. In F and G, you're bringing the dirt that we're paying to have removed because it's contaminated. Now we have to pay for additional dirt and topsoil back. Temporary restoration, paving, and fencing.
We think what's going to happen is that they're going to tell us that in the back area where we've put the backfill back, that we may have to put more permanent fencing. If you go out there, we have temporary fencing during construction. It's on legs, it's movable, but we thought they may require that we have something more paving, more permanent. And then the same thing with the paving. We'd like to get as much paving back if we could, because we want to increase the parking, but we're not sure. I'm not sure whether they're going to allow us to do it.
But how is that a function of the contaminated soil versus what you would have done otherwise?
They are saying that even though we put down the tarps and the plastic that we have the piles on, they're saying that that's not good enough. We want you to rip up the existing paving and 6 or 10 inches underneath it and repave it.
I'm failing to understand the logic on that one.
Join the club.
Point out which paving you're referring to.
The west part.
Currently, we have the piles are back here. A that is taken away was here. B and C are back here. So what we wanted to do is restore this, which we own as part of our original contract. They're saying, no, you have to dig it up, and wherever these piles were, you have to dig it up and replace it.
Paving,
Paving.
and that's
Paving.
number H.
Yes.
Paving underneath the piles?
Yes.
Never heard of that. So what are you going to do?
So then,
with contaminated soil?
so then, delay, demobilization, remobilization, 75?
It's a guess. We still have to finish this someday, and the best time to finish this is next summer. That's the next window of opportunity. So there will be, the contractor will have to demobilize, then he'll have to remobilize next summer, and then there'll be some kind of negotiation. I put in a number, but I don't know what it'll be.
And again, then the resealing and striping of the parking areas is because you did not anticipate having to dig up where the piles were.
That's part of it, and then I'm not sure what it's sort of a plug number, Steve, because I'm not sure where the fences are going to be or anything else, and I'm not sure what kind of temporary roadway pattern or temporary parking pattern I'm going to have to put in. So I put in some estimate to do some temporary resealing and marking, the striping.
When would that happen?
It's got to happen by the end of August. And then the last two items are reinstall temporary lighting and reinstall temporary cameras. As part of our original contract here was to take down all of the existing lighting and replace it with new LED lighting. That was part of what was in the original contract, the $1.8 million. We're not going to be able to do that because a lot of the electrical feeds are shallow, and we're worried about that they're going to be under in the contaminated areas. So one of the suggestions was not doing any more feeds or not putting in any more new light pole bases, because most of them are back here. We have a lot of them back here. Not to put those in, and to just reuse wherever we haven't dug up a light pole base, to put the old light pole back up, and the same thing with the security cameras. So it was a number we put in. We have asked the high school as to whether they could exist without lights, whether they could exist without security cameras. I don't know if they can.
You're talking on a permanent basis?
No, I'm talking about a temporary basis between now and next summer. Next summer, if we come back and finish this, I get the permanent LED lights, I get the permanent cameras that we own in the $1.8 million.
And you dig the trenches then, or you still don't?
You dig it then. At some point in time, when we come back here in the future, I have to finish this phase 1 site work, but I also have to build the auditorium. So between now and November, We have to figure out what the environmental constraints are going to be when we come back next year for the site work, and also what's going to happen in November are as far as what kind of environmental testing program right adjacent between the science wing and the gym. Is there anything in there that we have to worry about? We're hoping not.
Well, I guess that isn't that one of the million-dollar questions here is are we sitting on a site where simply it becomes cost prohibitive to actually start doing the auditorium project and excavating? If we think that there's going to be contamination where we put the auditorium, you're going to have a lot more fill and a lot more soil. Granted, you're going down farther, right? So as you go down, it should be less, presumably.
As you come up towards the science wing, the rock gets higher and the fill should get less. We're trying to understand that. We think, and that's an interesting question because the EPA has asked us that, what was built first? Was the high school built before you filled the fills, or was everything filled and then you built the high school on top of it? Bad question. I don't know. All I can tell you is as you come towards the science wing, there should be less and less fill because the rock is higher and there's the elevations are higher. But in our borings, we found that we do go down in a lot of areas, and we have a mix at the auditorium. Some places we're on rock, other places we're on piles because the rock is way down. So I don't know how to answer your question other than saying, yeah, when we do the auditorium, we're going to have to do a whole exploratory about how much that's going to be.
Where was the 115 level found for the PCBs? The highest level of the PCBs?
50. Was it 115? I know it's above 50. I'm not sure what it was on the trench that was in the back.
The wizard is asking that people use their microphone.
But was it at a specific point along the trench?
No, there was three. I think we had 3 or 4 different tests along the trench, and I think 2 or 3 out of the 5 came. I don't know.
Joe, are they outside this original scope?
We just because it'll get
Okay.
it'll get too unruly, and I don't mean to cut you off personally, but so why don't we open it up to questions? There's a whole segment that I'm sort of holding off on. I know we have a lot of land use agencies here and Parks and Rec here, because I know it's important that everybody be here. You've certainly heard, I'm sure, the conversation about how it is that we got here, vis-a-vis why didn't we test before, what was the approval process. I want to hold those questions off for right now and try to stick with either the numbers or what we're currently dealing with, and then we'll segue into sort of historical of approval process testing, what we should have done or shouldn't have done or what have you, and then we'll look forward, and maybe that's how we'll structure the debate tonight or the conversation. So dealing with the numbers and questions about where we are and or what Joe's opinion is on certain things. So first Art and then Bill.
Yes, Joe, you indicated in your presentation that some of this work is outside the scope of the MESA project. Can you quantify that?
I can't. I can tell you that the fills, the big numbers are for the contaminated fills. Those are within our contract limit lines because we didn't excavate beyond it. But it was right at the 18-foot into the field area, the grass area. All of the testing that's going on in the around the fields is well beyond the contract limit lines of MESA. However, then there's a bigger question. If MESA is being built on this soil, even if it's within the contract limit line, is that a MESA problem, or is it a town problem, or is it a Board of Ed problem? I don't know. It's all coming out of town of Greenwich Fund some way or another, but I'm not sure how you want to allocate that.
That's the thrust of my question is the $1.2 million we have here in these 1 through I. How much of that do you think is outside the scope of the MESA project?
Well, definitely the testing and inspection, most of that is beyond it. And it's just a question of how you want to say a pre-existing contaminated condition should be within a project or should be someplace else.
So it could be as much as $300,000 or $400,000 of this?
It could be the whole thing.
Okay.
In other words, if you look at all of the line items from B all the way down, D, No, C, excuse me, C, all the ways down, those are all within the contract limit lines. But it's just a question of whether you say that should be attributable to the project or that's attributable to a land cost. You know, a lot of times when you do pro formas, the land costs, whether it's demolition, contamination, all of those type things, are not part of the construction cost. The construction cost is bricks, mortars, et cetera.
I think conventional wisdom suggests that anything pertaining to the parking area, the 18 feet that you were going out, and then any testing having to do with the school, so your air samples, because that's in A, right? In your 40,000, you're including that in your A.
Yes.
Right? Are all MISA-related expenses.
Okay.
Right? Testing on the fields that beyond the 18-foot line, and at least in my mind, is an expense that is outside the scope of MISA. Yes, we're doing it because of issues that arose as a result of constructing MISA, but are being done and potentially have a liability or a cost associated with them beyond testing in terms of remediation, that in my mind is a different project. And so I think the question that Art was getting at was, out of the first two lines, the 40 and the 100, well, no, that to me, that's again, all
Yeah,
part
under
of,
Steve's definition, all of the items are under MISA, except for
A and B, correct?
A and B.
And
I would
and
say
what's the
A is
percentage?
predominantly MISA and B is not predominantly MISA. But I don't know, Steve, is
Okay.
75%, 25%, and then 25%, 75%. I don't know, but it's that weighted. Most of the air samples are done because we excavated and we wanted to see. So I'd say most of that is MISA, but most of the environmental phase 2, phase 3 testing out in the field certainly is not MISA. But we are sampling. We're using the same lab to define how much PCBs are in those piles, et cetera. So there's some.
Superintendent Sid Freund.
Good evening, and thank you.
Other one.
The other one, sorry. Good evening, and thank you again for coming out on such short notice. My understanding on DTC is in terms of their accounting, they're going to be tracking and being billed on this in terms of time and material. And when we thought it was $100,000, my understanding was that about $30,000 of that was attributable to MISA, and the rest of it was outside of MISA. So if you want to use that as a rough number, it's a 30 to 70%. Also, in terms of the testing that they're doing at the objective for the 143 samples is, as I understand it, is to really define the area that we're talking about of contamination. Then what's happening is, as I understand it, was called a risk assessment, and that's when they go down to approximately, we think, the 3 to 6 inches, and that will make a determination as to which, if any, of the fields, hopefully all of them, that will be able to open up for student use. Our time frame is August 22nd. That's when athletic practices begin. And August 25th is when we'd like the parking area restored, because that's when our staff returns.
Mr. Finger.
I have a number of questions. First of all, I think it's debatable whether items C through L are in fact all MISA. I mean, I could create a scenario where they should not be MISA. I don't know whether we need to debate that now, but if MISA was not happening and we were doing some trenching to put new electrical lines in there and we discovered this, we'd be in the same place, MISA or no MISA. But a number of questions I had, Joe, about the testing. You have phase 2 and phase 3 in B. What about phase 1?
Phase 1 is a historical report, and phase 1 is being completed now. The phase 1 is you go back to the town records. You try to understand.
Okay. I understand what a phase 1 is.
I'm sorry.
Has that been contracted for, and the several $1,000s I suspect that's costing? Where's that?
The phase 1 report is actually contracted for. It's about $15,000 to $20,000, but it was already in our budgets.
Okay.
The reason being is when you apply for the state reimbursement, the BSF, that's on our checklist. So the phase 1 is almost finished. Now it's been augmented tremendously by as known conditions.
Okay. The phase 2 testing, when is that going to begin? I mean, assuming we appropriate money tonight, do you wait until the Phase 1 is completed, or are they going to go ahead and start doing testing prior to receipt of the Phase 2, the Phase 1?
A lot of the tests that we've done already can qualify as Phase 2, and we did that with funds that we still had some temporarily out of the pre-construction budget. But that's minor, and I'm running out of whatever we had. But the tests that we've done so far, to the indicators of whatever, will qualify as part of the Phase 2. That there will be additional tests to finish up the Phase 2.
And DTC is our LEP, is our licensed environmental professional,
Yes, they are.
and we feel that their prices are competitive? That they're not, taking advantage of the situation?
I'm using the unit prices that are in the town contract. They're a town on-call services for civil engineering and environmental engineering, and I'm using their rates. I've asked them to do better, but I'm using their rates.
Okay. The estimates that you have here for the removal of the contaminated fill and the topsoil, how are those numbers based?
Those
I mean,
were those were generated by Turner Construction. They did a rough survey of the volume, converted it into tons, and then they used an average price that we were getting from our consultant as what we should pay, and then we're getting 3 bids in to double check to see where we can get the best unit price.
Have you considered ongoing costs for environmental monitoring? I mean, I don't know a whole lot about environmental testing, but I do know that if you have a certain amount of contaminants, you might fall into the definition of an establishment under DEP rules, which require a certain amount of money. That's not an insignificant cost going forward.
If we could cap or finish the excavation on the MESA part of this, we're hoping that all of the air monitoring and all of those type things stop. If the fields come up where you can use them again, I'm not sure what they would want. I mean, once you determine it's not a factor, I'm not sure whether there's ongoing. When we start in November on the auditorium, you will kick in some more monitoring because you already have a red flag on the project. But I'm not sure if there's. I guess we could ask our consultant, but I'm not sure there is an ongoing monitoring forever or for a certain amount of time based upon what you find.
Last question. Worst case scenario, as we get into Phase 2 and Phase 3 testing, as they start moving further than the 18 feet, getting into the fields, do you have an idea or estimates of what we might be looking at for testing if we start going to the artificial turf areas?
I don't know. This 100,000 guesstimate, which was probably closer now to 200,000, what we heard today, essentially goes around the perimeter of all of the fields, or a lot of the fields. It doesn't go into the artificial turf. I think they started with just where they can get grass areas and get an idea. I think that's where the 146 tests come from.
I think from a town standpoint, one of the big concerns we should have is as they start going and determining the delineation of the contaminants, where does that take us? I mean, we conceivably could be looking at quite a large area, and we see what the costs are to remove what I'll say is a relatively small amount of contaminated soil. It just put it out there that nobody should be surprised if we find that this is a much bigger issue and not a MESA issue, just a town issue on. I
think you'll be able to see some of those results within the next week and a half to 2 weeks. We haven't seen it yet because they're just taking the samples now. So we're hoping they're supposed to finish the 146 samples, as I understand it, by the end of this week, Monday or Tuesday next week.
Wednesday or Thursday we'll have the results, I'm told.
Okay, so I guess by the end of next week you'll have some kind of preliminary report. And what we've asked for is a comprehensive report with an executive summary, because just distributing the test doesn't mean a whole lot to me, and I'm sure doesn't mean a whole lot to you. So I'm hoping then that we would get that executive summary and opinion by then too.
First, Mr. Pellegrino, and then Ms. Tarkington, but before I turn it over, so to Mr. Finger's point, and this is more for our body, so we're set up in such a way that if any of these items, if this board feels that these are not MESA items, then what we're talking about isn't a release of a condition, is an additional appropriation. And if it's an interim additional appropriation, it's going to need the approval of the RTM. And so, unless, I know there's a provision, and I'm turning to Mr. Mason because I hope he has his charter with him. Because then we fall under, potentially, we could argue that this is an emergency appropriation. But I just, so as the finance board, though, to answer Mr. Finger's point, though, we do have to make a determination today whether or not we consider these costs allocable to MISA or not, because as a matter of process, if it's not, then we have to appropriate from a different fund than the money that's already has been appropriated for MISA. And so as you hear the conversation, that might play into your decision as to whether or not you think it's MISA or not. I've certainly laid out what I think are allocable MISA costs and what are not. Obviously, there could be a difference of an opinion about that, and so we will have to address that issue tonight. So I think I said Mr. Pellegrino, Ms. Tarkington, and then Mr. Simon.
Joe, who's driving the bus here?
Right now, the building committee, in conjunction with the Board of Ed, because we felt we were the best equipped, because we have people on the job site, we had testing labs that were working for us, et cetera, I won't say we're driving the bus, but we're certainly on the bus monitoring what's going on. I think the DEP and the Environmental Protection Agency is really driving the bus over the next couple of weeks and telling us what they're going to accept as far as where we can go with landfill with Pile B and Pile C, what they're going to accept as the types of tests, and then once they get the results of those tests, I think they're going to determine, along with whatever the Board of Ed's recommendation is going to be as far as reuse of the fields or whatever it's going to be.
And just so I understand better, is this the federal government or the state government or a combination of the two when you talk about Department of Environmental Protection?
Both. The state is up in Hartford. That's the state DEP. And the Environmental Protection Agency is federal. We come under those guidelines because of and that's this, I forgot her name. She's based in Boston and has been in our conversations. She hasn't come down yet. So it's both. And there are regulations that are actually better under the federal and are stiffer under the state, and the federal government will abdicate their position to the state, who has, I think, in these cases on PCB, a little higher standards. But in either case, whoever's got the higher standard, we are going to have to.
All right, so we have to meet the higher standard of the two, and right now that would seem to be the forces that are driving the direction in which we're going in.
Yeah, I think both are, but it sounded like, and Sid, you could tell me, it sounded like EPA was taking a secondary position at the meetings, but is very interested that we're doing all of these things and that it complies with federal regs. But I think what's going to drive it is the state.
Okay.
And there's two parts of the state. Let me just
so I understand the chain of command. This really goes to the school board. This goes to the superintendent's office in terms of the chain of command in terms of decisions. It goes to you, or what's just the flow so we all understand
right now
who's making decisions along the way. Right
now we're heading that and trying to direct the tests being done, where the piles go, how do we finish this job. But on anything to do with whether the Board of Ed feels comfortable with air quality or fields or anything, it's really the Board of Ed. We're there as convenience because we're there, but we think it's the best for us to do it. And whether it's the best financial vehicle, I'll leave that up to you. But certainly we can help accomplish what we need to accomplish in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think better than anybody else can, but I'm not volunteering to do it. I just think we're there. We dug up the stuff, and I think we're asking all the right questions, and I think we could help solve the problem.
Okay. Second group of questions, Joe. At least from what I heard you present, it sounds like the testing that's being asked by the governmental agencies is now going out away from the existing building facilities and parking lots into the fields or the envelope, let's say, of the property, is my understanding. Have they at all indicated any interest of coming back to within the scope of the existing building and parking lot to do testing there?
I don't think so yet, but that may be in the future. Right now, they're concentrating on what we've given them, and I think it was the Board of Ed decision saying we want to understand what's going on in the fields, and they said, yes, you should be understanding what's going on in the fields. They haven't come back to us and said, we want to know what's going to be in the parking lot, but when we apply for the actual auditorium construction, we're going to have all our ducks in a row about that as to what they may want, air monitoring, segregation, et
So
cetera.
not unreasonable to say if you actually do have to dig up the pavement where the soils are, or the piles are right now, we're going to end up having to test there?
Yes,
When we start breaking in the ground for where the new auditorium's going to go, we'll probably end up having to test there too?
yes. Actually, they may require that you test beforehand, in which case then you'll take, some vacation time or some time where the school's not occupied and do some test pits for them.
This is a question in my mind. Are we better off being preemptive and just going ahead and start testing this stuff now or not?
Our suggestion is to win this battle first, and I've got until November to understand what we have to do on the others, but that may be suggested by them. I don't know.
Okay.
I would like not to expand where we're testing
Sure.
right now, if we could, but
Okay.
that's not my purview either.
Okay, third group of questions. Are you discussing with us this wetlands drainage revisions numbers? Because I'm not clear.
We'll take that up after this.
Separately?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you, Joe.
Tarkington.
Joe, I just had a question to Mr. Finger's point here. I think this property is 55 acres in total. Can you just point out where the PA 490 property is on that, the conservation property or whatever it is?
I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure there is conservation property on here, but I know we're under two different zoning. I know we have wetland surveys, but I'm not sure whether there's a conservation zone that I know of.
Conservation area near the post road, you know where the waterfall is?
Ah, okay.
That's the area.
Thank you.
Mr. Simon.
I just want to make sure I understand that once you do steps 1 through A through H, we will have successfully remediated the area. We will have filled the land with clean topsoil or soil, and we will have paved it, and we will have striped it, and people can park there?
We will have done that for that strip of land,
The 18 feet.
the 18 feet and a little bit into the parking area.
And we will then be able to park on it.
I'm hoping, and that's why I put into, repave or reseal, or I'm hoping we're able to. They may tell us no, put a better fence up and stay off of the area. I don't know. Our wish is that we can get that area back.
But this is not an insolvable problem. It may be an expensive problem.
We do environmental sites. A lot of times there are companies that do that specialty. It's very expensive, but it can be done. It's just to the extent that you understand where the contaminated fill is, and a judgment of whether it's disturbed, it's volatile, or it's encapsulated, is my understanding. But that's something that will come from the consultants.
Okay, thank you.
Superintendent?
I want to return to Joe's question in terms of the role of a superintendent in this. This is not an area that they train you in an administration school. So I get my guidance primarily in this case from DTC and from EAS, the two companies that we're consulting with, and my role, as I see it, is to help everyone understand logistically what our needs are as the occupants of the school as we approach the start of school, so that we can open with minimal disruption. The recommendation that we got was, and we acted on it as soon as we understood and that what the contaminants were and potential danger, was to be prudent. And the recommendation was close the fields until further notice. We did get back today a second test of air samples, and they came back clean as well, both inside the building and outside, which is terrific. So we have no reason to believe at this point in time that anyone who had been inside the building or anyone who has played on the fields has been put in danger at any point in time. That's the best information that we have right now. But in the spirit of full disclosure, what I sort of heard today from the EAP and from the DEP is that even though we may be able to reopen those fields and in the short term, there still may be the need, based on the results that we receive, for cleanup on that property. So we may be able to use those fields in the short term, but there still may be cleanup costs. Again, we'll have a better idea of that once we get the results next Wednesday or Thursday.
Mr. Campbell and then Mr. Raymer.
As long as you're addressing that point, Sid, just if I understood it correctly, the decision to test the fields is one that was made by the Board of Ed. It may be that the regulators agreed with that decision, but they didn't tell you to test around the fields. You made that decision.
The recommendation that came from DTC, reviewed at the building committee level, was to do that to do those continuing tests. The district, the Board of Education itself, has its own contract with DTC and uses them in an advisory capacity, and the process was begun for the testing.
So we were not, the BOE, no one was ordered to do that additional testing by the regulators?
No, that is correct.
Mr. Raymer.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One, on item B, the environmental phase 2 and 3, the 100,000, Joe, that's work that's being done off the rate card. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm asking these first few questions because I had one or two people raising issue through me about the magnitude of the dollars. I just wanted to touch some of the greater items. On D and E, the 180,000 and the 560,000, are those the items on which you're doing competitive bids?
Yes.
Okay. Both of them?
Yes.
On item I, the cost to delay, demobilize, and remobilize in the summer of 2012, I'm wondering if a portion of that $75,000 may perhaps be delayed in its payment to next year, so that a portion of that could be used to supplement the $100,000 in B that you are now fearful might be enough. Can I ask, of the $75,000, what portion of that perhaps would not be incurred in the near months but would be incurred only in 2012?
As far as a cash flow basis, you're correct. But to make the commitment to the contractor that he is to demobilize and remobilize, you're supposed to have those monies allocated or approved. So from cash flow, correct, but not from directing him to do so.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. On the subtotal of the $1,215,000, is it more or less your conclusion that no matter what we do with the MISA project, that sum is now going to be incurred because of what we're looking at now by way of the contamination?
I'm not sure what you mean. It's going to be incurred.
It's going to be incurred.
Yeah.
Period. Full stop.
I think so, yeah. I mean, we'll try to mitigate any of these unit prices or these costs, but we're going to incur these costs to get it back to where we need to in the next 3 or 4 weeks.
I'd like to go back lastly to Mr. Pellegrino's question. He had asked you, if I understood Mr. Pellegrino correctly, why wouldn't we go off and do, well, maybe it was Mr. Finger, I'm not quite sure now. Why wouldn't we be doing some of the further testing now among the testing that you could more or less conclude we're almost overwhelmingly likely to be asked to do?
Just not to cloud the decisions or the testing. We could test the whole site. We could go on to the 2 areas that we're going to build. I'm not sure you want to do that yet.
I don't mean to become a volunteer and look for trouble, but to the extent that we're going to be asked over the next 3 months, almost certainly by the DEP and EPA, to do testing, let's say, out in the fields. I don't know that that's the case, but if it's your conclusion from how you're being advised by the consultants that it is extremely likely that you're going to be asked to do testing in the fields, it's extremely likely that you're going to be asked to do testing at the site of what's going to become the grave of the pit that's going to be dug for the new MISA project. If we're going to be asked to do that testing, I don't know why we'd postpone getting those results. I think we'd be better off getting those results sooner rather than later.
Can be. We thought we had enough on our plate just to get it done. We're doing 146 tests, and now we're going to do another 146 tests. There's no question that before November, when we break ground, we're going to have to do it. So yes, it could be. It needs to be done before then. I'm up for suggestions as to whether it should be done now or in October. I don't have a feeling either way, other than my gut was try to resolve the problems we have before we expand. But it could be. Eventually, you're going to have to do it. I agree with you.
Okay, hold on. Still on sort of the topic right now. I just remind everybody, once again, not to cut off debate. Obviously, this is an important topic. It's a lot of money. It's 6 o'clock now, and we haven't touched on any of the other sort of land use issues and the other items on here, and the issue of the potential appropriation. So, in that light, Mr. Finger.
Just further to Jeff's last comment, my understanding is that in the Phase 3, the LEP is going out and determining the delineation of the contamination. So I would imagine if they continue to move from that 18 feet and they still see whatever the levels of PCBs or whatever are high, I would imagine they would continue to go further and further out. So it's conceivable that, that in and of itself will be dictating when this additional testing is being done.
I think you're correct. I think our assumption was the fields need to be used as quickly as possible. So the fact that the tests are migrating out towards the fields is a good thing to resolve the use of the fields. The tests migrating back up into the paved parking lot where the MISA footprint, it's encapsulated now, but it won't be in November. So it's a difference. It's just a difference in time and emphasis of where you want to go. But eventually, you're going to have to do both. The key item is to try to get people back on the fields. So you would let the tests migrate towards the fields and then come back and do it the other way. But you're right. It'll be both eventually.
Mr. Pellegrino.
Jeff, what I was trying to get at with that question also is, if a member of the public were to ask me, what's the cost of this project now? That'd be disingenuous if I said I knew, because I don't know. Because I don't know now if I have problems with where the auditorium is going to build. I don't know if I have problems in the parking lot. And I'm just putting that out there because I don't think anybody knows.
Okay, no, we're not going to go back and forth. Sure. And Mr. Pellegrino, maybe we'll have the conversation with the public. So, just on the point of the additional testing, and then we'll move off of that for a little bit. So, eventually, we're going to test where you intend to construct new buildings. In essence, the auditorium and the music space.
Correct.
And if it is found, although there is more rock there and therefore less soil, so therefore less likelihood that there's going to be contamination there, if I heard you correct. But if there is contamination there, is it likely then that we would be forced to test under the current buildings? And if so, does that open up an area a road that we don't want to go down?
I don't know. I can tell you that once the historical Phase 1 comes in, and that's my comment before, it'll depend, in somebody's mind, it'll depend whether the whole area was filled before you built the high school or whether the high school was built and then you filled it, in which case then you could argue there should be nothing under the buildings. But I don't know. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. But I don't think building MISA is going to precipitate that. I think it's already precipitated by what we found there now. I think if the EPA or the state is going to say, I want you to test more, the front of the building or whatever, they're going to tell you that. I don't think it's going to be precipitated by us digging there. Now, we're going to have to test because we have to know how to handle the soil, but I'm not so sure that that's going to precipitate whether the state or federal wants you to continue testing other places on the site.
Well, that conversation isn't going to conclude tonight, obviously. But right. As I look at the site, you're testing west, and I'm talking about testing coming east, and I'm not sure why, if the testing going west even comes up clean, why, if you then ultimately test coming east, you find further contamination, that you don't open yourself up then to further testing and especially testing under the building. So I raise that as a point because at least before I'm going to approve further release of conditions for when you come back for the other construction money, I think that conversation is going to need to have happened previous to that request for additional monies. But let me move to the notion of an additional appropriation, because if so, quite frankly, Mr. Mason has provided me with his copy of the charter, and it is slightly ambiguous. And so my suggestion is that if we feel that at this point in time that the number of the 1.215, if any of that should be either a separate capital item, an additional appropriation, or an additional appropriation, then at the very least, I'd like to try to get the town attorney on the phone, because the language, as we all know in the charter, is somewhat inartful at times, and I think this is one section that is open to interpretation.
Section you're looking at?
Sure. Section 28 of the Charter, entitled Appropriations to Emergency Fund, which reads, when there shall be a special emergency, the town may, on the recommendation of the Board of Estimate and Taxation, make an appropriation to a special emergency fund to be allocated by the board from time to time to and for the purpose of such department or departments, which will, in the opinion of the board, in the execution of its purpose, best secure the objects of such appropriations, with the power in the board to, from time to time, change such allotment as to the uncommitted balance thereof. I'll read for you the point that I think is subject to interpretation, is the word town in the first line. When there shall be a special emergency, the town may, on the recommendation of the Board of Estimate and Taxation, and then goes forward to say, lists us as the board. So do we have the power not only to recommend, but do we also fall under the phrase or word of the town as in Section 28? So that's the issue. I, for one, think that at least in A and or B do not all fall within MISA, but I also think that they're operating expenses and can be borne out of the operating fund of the Board of Ed and should be subsumed. And then if there's less returned next year, or if in fact the Board of Ed needs to come forward because they're unable to meet what they want, they'll come for an interim appropriation at that time. But that's just my opinion, and it'll be up to this body to make that determination.
Could you be a little clearer, Mr. Chairman, on what you just proposed?
What's that?
If you don't mind, I want you to be. Are you proposing that the Board of Education incur the $1,215,000 out of operating funds?
No, I am suggesting that a portion of A, 1A, and a portion of 1B. And my understanding is that in A, that would be 70% of A and no. 30% of A and 70% of B come out of the Board of Ed's operating budget.
Mr. Chairman, I would move.
Hold on. So that was, I took Mr. Raymer's question as a point of information.
Thank you.
Mr. Mason was next, and just on the point of the appropriation, because then we need to move off that.
Yes.
Mr. Mason, then Mr. Pellegrino, and then Ms. Tarkington.
I may be changing the subject just a tad, and you'll excuse me if I am. What I haven't heard yet, I've heard the town has got a problem. We've run into soil. I have not heard anything but a reaction to the problem. We have Turner Construction on site. They run this problem before. We have land use in a room. We have all the departments. What are the experts who, this has happened before in the private sector, this has happened before in the public sector. We've run into a problem. This is going to make us decide a decision whether we need to remediate fields or continue with the project, not continue with the project. What are the professionals? In other words, I appreciate all your work, but where I'm at is Turner Construction should be saying in past jobs or whatever the case may be, is this is the road you should go. You should focus on the remediation. We should do all the testing that you want to do for doing this remediation, get a scope of that work, a cost of that work, then apply that to the scope of the work for the MISA project and the cost of that project. That, to me, seems to be the approach. We're sitting here deciding, do we want to test the fields? Do we want to test this direction? I don't see that. And if I'm off base, I mean, please, there's a lot at stake here. But that's what we're not talking about. What we're not talking about is what is the plan, and then what is the strategy to get there. We can't keep coming back for more money every month or two as we decide that we're going to do this. Mr. Campbell brought out an interesting point. We're testing the soil around the synthetic fields that are out there. We haven't had a problem. If this job was going there, what the DEP would have us remediate everything within the project zone. That's what they would have us remediate. The fact is, because it's a school ground, we're sitting here with extra concerns that there might be contamination out there, but we've never had a problem. We're not getting the airborne test back. That's where I would like to see us decide how we're going, and then the funding of it is secondary to that.
Mr. Pellegrino.
I think I'm just going to comment, Mr. Chairman, on your point. In my opinion, it's really 1.315 million, because Joe has said on information today it's another 100,000. I would think that is absolutely, in my mind, what you said, MISA, except for a carve-out of 30% of A and 70% of B, which I am assuming the Board of Ed is going to assume the cost of in their appropriations for their existing budget.
Do you want me
Yeah,
to answer your question?
No.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks.
I have another view. I think that this has occurred, had this project not occurred, these issues wouldn't have been raised. And in order to expedite this and to make it less complicated, this amounts to something less than 7% of the total of $1,215,000. I think that at least at this point to proceed, including it in MISA, but clearly reviewing it and understanding so that the Board of Education is ready to pick up any costs that could occur thereafter. But again, I think that this results because of this MISA, and since it's basically something less than 7%, it's not that material. We should just proceed, get this done as they've asked, and then obviously consider the details of it and how it's handled for the future.
Mr. Raymer.
I mean, the mere fact that something is discovered in the course of a MISA project doesn't make it a MISA expense. It could have been discovered in the course of a girls' lacrosse game by some chemist father who comes down to watch his daughter's game, and that doesn't make it an expense of the girls' lacrosse program. The cost of the amelioration of the contamination is only, to my mind, is only a MISA expense to the extent that the MISA project exacerbates the expense to do the remediation. Whatever would have been the cost, whatever is going to be the cost of the remediation is a consequence of the contamination. The MISA project didn't cause the contamination. The fields aren't closed because the fields are safe. Or there's concern about the safety, and the fields are closed because they're under the existing test results. There's the possibility of a hazard, and that has nothing to do with MISA. At the end of the day, we may have 12 different views about how this gets allocated back and forth between MISA or not MISA. But the fact of the matter is that based upon what's been found, we're going to end up doing some testing, whether we like it or not, and we're going to end up probably doing some remediation, whether we like it or not. It does seem to me that from the powers that were described under Section 28 of the Charter as the chair read it, it seems to me, I was reasonably satisfied. I'm only one member of a board of 12, but I'm reasonably satisfied that this board has an ability as an emergency appropriation to appropriate funds. We have an inability to get a nice, bright, clear line at this point of our knowledge between what's MISA and what's not MISA, but we have the funds available through an appropriation that we did on MISA. And I think this particular circumstance lends itself to our requesting that MISA handle, the MISA Building Committee handle the existing problem as our point man, and that we allow them the funding and do it through them. At the end of the day, when it turns out later on that we can make a bright line between what's MISA and what's not MISA, I can justify the not MISA dollars that I spent here tonight under the emergency powers of Section 28. And I can justify the MISA expenses as being a field condition that was experienced in MISA. And I think the possibility exists for us to authorize the expense and have the difficult conversation of how we allocate back and forth between MISA and non-MISA at another night when we're all in a better sense of humor.
Mr. Finger, I'll defer right now.
I concur with the comments by Mr. Raymer. I also want to point out that I'm a little troubled by comments that this is a MISA event. We are where we are because MISA is doing everything right. We've been criticized, the town's been criticized before on other projects. We have a construction manager here, we have a very strong building committee under the able leadership of Joe Ross. They've done everything right. We had a contractor, a subcontractor, who, we don't like the results, but saw something that looked unusual and brought it to somebody's attention. There's been a lot of work done at that high school over the years. There was a science wing, turf fields put in, parking lots been redone, wiring's been done. It could very well have been that, contractors ignored dark soil before, and had somebody been as conscientious as those working on MISA, we might have been addressing this problem years ago. Fact of the matter is, as a town, we have a town issue. We need to get the money appropriated, and that's why I concur with Jeff that, maybe at some other point we could have the more time-consuming argument about where the funds should be allocated. We need to get it done now. We need to do the testing. We need to get rid of the soil. We need to move forward, not just for MISA, but for the sake of finding out what our problem is at the high school, if we have a problem, and ameliorating that issue.
Here's what I'm going to propose. First, I'll respectfully disagree with both Mr. Raymer and Mr. Finger on this. I don't think we can have our cake and eat it too. I don't think we can say that it's a MISA-related function simply for funding purposes and then say we'll revisit it just to avoid having to go to the RTM or use the process that's in the charter. Although I understood Mr. Raymer to believe that under 28 we have the ability for an emergency fund. But if we think tonight that this is not a MISA cost, then we should act appropriately, and we should then consider it to be an additional appropriation and not simply fall under MISA because that's the path of least resistance. We should make a determination about this, and we should move forward. I look at this as if it was rock excavation, which we hit too much of that in Hamilton Avenue. The town treated it as a Hamilton Avenue expense. It wasn't a town expense at that point. It was a Hamilton Avenue expense. And that's why, in my mind, there is a differentiation between field testing and field remediation and remediation solely relating to the work that was being contemplated as a result of MISA. That being said, what I propose to have happen here is I'm going to turn over the chair to Mr. Campbell to start the discussion on the approval process and why there were several questions regarding why we didn't test previously, whether or not that was needed within the approval process. I know the land use agencies are here to help us with that discussion. In the meantime, I will confer with the town attorney, hopefully, and then at least have an understanding so that we all know whether or not we have at our disposal tonight the ability to approve an emergency appropriation. And if so, at least we know that's an option for any amount. Okay? Mr. Rayner, do you have a point of information, or?
I'm going to respond.
Well, let's move on, and then we're going to come back to it once I get the response from Mr. Fox, and that might alter it, or some of the other further conversation.
I respect the chair.
Steve, just a point of information.
Sure.
So are you going to be speaking to the town attorney about whether this body without the concurrence of the RTM or any other body can make the appropriation?
Any appropriation of any amount, and then it's
If
up
the
to us.
emergency-
That's right.
Okay.
Okay? Mr. Raymer, then Mr. Simon.
This is not the response. I was going, if it enhances the discussion, I was going to make the motion, and I don't know if the court wishes to, if the chair wishes to entertain the motion at this point.
Why don't we just sort of hold that thought? I'll come back to you after.
Fair enough.
Just because I think people want to know whether or not we have this option available to us. Mr. Simon.
Yeah, but there may be a majority sentiment to say we would take out $82,000 from this appropriation. That's the 70% of the 100 and 30% of the 40. That's the number you came to.
Well, I didn't because I agree with Mr. Pellegrino that it's really a 200 number, and you're really requesting 1.315. That we already know this. We know that they're going to ask for this additional testing.
So the question is,
Well,
does the 200,000, how much of that belongs to MISA?
I think the same
70%.
70% goes to the field,
Right.
so that would be 140, and 30% of the other one, which is
12.
so that's 152,000. I think that's how you got your number.
That's right. That's
Right.
exactly right.
That's the number.
150,000 goes to some other appropriation, and that's subtracted from this 1,350,000.
Yes,
So you would want 1,315, and you'd want to subtract out
152.
I personally would subtract out 152,000, leaving a balance requested to release of 1.163. Well, hold on. I didn't let Mr. Raymer make a motion, so I just I want to be fair here.
So you would end up subtracting 52,000 from the existing appropriation.
152. Once again, because I'm using 1.3.
But you're only dealing with this part of it, not this part of it.
That's right, but I've already increased the 1.215, increasing it by 100,000.
But essentially, you're reducing the 1,215 to 1,163
1,163.
by 52,000. That's the $52,000 difference.
152.
I got all that. Subtracting from their
From their request.
You're subtracting
Fair enough.
$52,000.
Yes.
You're proposing they absorb internally the 140 and the 28, and there's probably a majority sentiment for that, and we can move right along. We can ask that question. How's that?
So how about this? I will go and entertain a conversation with Wayne Fox if, after hearing Mr. Simon's questions, any member of this board would like an answer to Section 28. Fair enough. Mr. Campbell?
Does Wayne know he's going to be called?
Well,
Does Wayne have a copy of the charter?
before we transit, Leslie, go ahead.
Joe, I have one question for you. Is there any kind of indicator that would say on an acre of, contaminated soil, if you're removing, say, 12 inches, your whole thing there, can you relate that to tons, or how much, if you take 1 acre?
Acre is, now you're testing my math,
43,000.
46,000 square feet times 1 foot thick, it's 46,000 cubic feet. You divide 43,580, say 43,000, say 44,000, because I can't multiply times 43,560. So 44,000 square feet times 1 foot thick, divided by 27, that gets you cubic yards. And cubic yards to ton for this soil is probably 1.5, 1.6. So you multiply it times 1.6.
Thank you.
Joe,
If you want to tell me the answer, because I don't know that.
How many dollars per ton?
And $250 a ton. Between $200 and $250 a ton is the price range that we think it's going to be at, depending on where the bids come in tomorrow.
Astronomical number.
Okay. Before we go on, Joe, to the land use agencies that have been waiting here, Mr. Mason had kind of a question and a commentary, and I think you were prepared to give a response, and maybe you want to do that.
Yeah, I think the plan is definitive of what we need to do in just this section. We've met with Turner. We know the piles have been segregated. We know as far as what we had to do to encapsulate them. We're dealing with the agency to determine on the topsoil pile what the mix level could be on the PCBs or not, or how we segregate. And so I think we have all of those things as a plan. We've looked at alternatives of putting it back in the trench or doing other things, which we were told no. So I think our plan here is definitive of what we do in the next 3 weeks, but it's not definitive of where we go after that. But we have talked to Turner, we have talked to DTC, we've talked to everybody involved, and we feel that the best plan is to finish the 3 areas that are not contaminated, get the paving done, the drainage done, everything done, and on the contaminated areas, remove the piles and try to level off, encapsulate, pave, put fences up, whatever they're going to make us do, and then walk away by the 3rd week in August from that area. Then to recoup, that's what these dollars are. And then not terminate the contractor, just give him direction to demobilize and come back next year, next summer, and finish those areas. So I think that's what we're saying here is the plan. But that's only the plan to get to finish the first phase site work. It's not the plan of where we're going to go with the fields or Board of Ed or Parks and Rec or anybody else as far as what needs to be done. You're right. There we don't have a plan. But we do have a plan right now over the next 3 weeks, and this is our estimate of that plan.
Mr. Mason, go ahead.
Then I would ask on behalf of, of this board, I would say it would be very important to us to know, because we had this at the Cascade Power Plant, we were talking about synthetic fields and capping and all that. I think we better start building some type of a presentation to us, the size of the fields, the potential, what the standards are for a clean cap on top of any pollution, what synthetic fields allow us to reduce the coverage of fresh soil. I think we need what I'm looking for is I want to know what the exposure is to the community. The exposure, if the fields now are an issue and the Board of Ed feels that the remediation of the fields is the priority, I need to know, I personally would need to know what that exposure is to the community. That exposure could determine the future of this capital project and maybe others. This could be an incredible number, and if we don't have that information going forward, we're being reactionary. I think we need the big plan. Here's the potential.
I think the building committee is limited to what it can do.
I understand.
However, Board of Ed and Parks and Rec
right.
have a lot of say about what goes on to the Cascade Power Plant or the other fields.
I was looking at I was looking in other directions when I was saying that.
I don't disagree with you on that. And if that information is going to be critical information, I think after next Wednesday or Thursday, when those 143 samples come back, we'll have some better idea of whether they're going to have to go out further. And I understand also that we are getting some information on what would be involved in testing if we have to go underneath the turf fields. And the question came up, I want to make sure that we don't void the warranties on those fields and do that in the right way. But that is critical information. No question that just on the question that was asked by Leslie related to one acre, and you start doing the math on that at $250 a ton, it's a huge number. So that is certainly critical information to have, that you should have as you decide on how you're going to allocate funds in the future. And then the question is going to be where does the responsibility for getting that information lie? Does that lie with the Board of Education? If you tell us if that's your decision, then I'll have to go back to my board and we'll have to appropriate accordingly. And at some point in time, may have to come back and ask for a special appropriation if we don't have sufficient funding to do that.
I think the issue is that the team is here. I mean, there's members of the whole team here. I think whatever way we need to get to those answers, so be it. I mean, DPW has experience with this at the power plant. Parks and Rec has it with some of the field installations that they've done. I think the team is here, and I do respect that it's not just this doesn't happen, but I would think before we can really decide what we're doing here, we need some type of an exposure picture here.
I don't disagree with you. I think what you have before you is what we need to open school. Basically, that's what we need right now to reinstate the parking areas that we have, so that we can open school and hopefully utilize those fields. If we can't utilize those fields, we are developing a contingency plan. There will be an additional expense that the Board of Education will incur related to that. And I have an estimate, at least just related to transportation, of approximately $125,000 if we have to look for alternate locations. That does not include the potential rental fees that we might have to pay, which we have no idea of what that might be at this point in time. But just from transporting our teams for practices and looking for alternate sites for home games, we're looking at about $125,000 right now at cost. Then the additional testing that might have to be done, and don't know. Just don't know what that is, and we need more information. We're going to need help. Again, it's outside of the training that we have as administrators, and I would look to some guidance and support and ongoing from the building committee and from the consultants, DTC and Charles Swartz, was it AE, whatever his initials are, and support of that, and we'll go from there.
Mr. Rammer?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Mr. Mason raises exactly the point that I was struggling to raise with Mr. Ross before, and that is that, well, in a sense, I guess I think we don't quite have the whole team here, and that is I would like to have the advice of some of the people with an expertise in this field, so they can present to us a bit, so we have a better understanding about what is the outer limit here? If we actually had to do a major remediation on the entire high school tract, what could we be looking at then by way of dollars? And how does that impact the decisions we're making about other things that we're doing here? And how likely is that to occur? If they view that as being extremely unlikely, that's a piece of information. If they view that as being entirely within the realm of possibility, that's a piece of information. And if the dollars on that are XYZ dollars, I'd like to know that. And that's the rationale, Joe, by which I had it in mind with, I wouldn't mind to have done more testing and to have listened to what the experts are saying. I don't want to become a volunteer to make trouble for ourselves with the DEP and the EPA. But if we're going to be asked to do this testing anyway later on, and if this testing would help our experts tell us what we're looking at here, is this a little mess or is this a big mess, I wouldn't mind to know that. And then I wouldn't mind to have the experts help us attach a dollar significance to that so we understand that as well.
I think we could, in the next week when we get the preliminary test back, I think we could bring in DTC, EAS, our building committee people, Turner, anybody else, any of the land use people, into a meeting. We could certainly have it, in your presence or a subcommittee of your presence and go through that. But I don't think we're quite there yet. We need to see the results, at least the preliminary results. Otherwise, we're all just talking about what-if scenarios. Certainly within the next 2 weeks, we could set that up. We would, as the building committee, even would be happy to spearhead that if you would like us to do it. We certainly could do it, but I think you're probably 2 weeks premature in really knowing what's out there for a consultant to give you. He can give you a lot of what-ifs, but I'd rather he base it on what we find. But it certainly could be done in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Joe, maybe you would, I think we have a couple of things that we still need to do. One is to look at the remaining items here, if you want to kind of walk us through items 2 and items 3, the wetland drainage revisions, and then what you have down for tree logging. And then I know the land use agencies have been waiting, and I know members have some questions for them about this whole process. So we'll move to that after.
All right. Item 2 is some revisions that we did where we actually put in mechanical filtration. It's called a Vortec unit versus this bioswale that we were trying to put in originally. And when we came up with it, we thought we understood it. We understood it was due to some soil conditions that were there. We understood it that it was a better way to save about 15 to 18 trees, which help us when we go back into another phase. So we put a cost on this, and we negotiated this with Cherry Hill and the design team, and we believe this is a legitimate cost. However, we were going to take this out of our contingency in the future. The problem is we're running out of contingency with all of these other things. So what we asked was that we consider this as an additional, take it out of the MESA funding because it's in the future contingency. It's just not in my current contingency. The tree logging and the milling was part of a much bigger dollar for the additional trees, the additional Silvacell, the drainage system. I don't know. Silvacell drainage system that the tree warden wanted, some additional bollards and additional guarantees. We think that was considerable dollars, but we had to expend some of it now because part of what he wanted was us to not dispose of the trees, but he wanted to pick 10 trees or 7 trees, log them, and send them to a mill. They will be sawn, they will be cured, and they will be returned back to the industrial arts program, or whatever it's called at the high school, and that's what that is. Again, we were planning on taking that out of our contingency in the future. The problem is we thought all of the tree warden stuff was in the future. It's not. This component I need to do now, and I'm running out of contingency. So I was looking to advance the $75,000 and the $10,000 from the future MISA contingency as part of a job cost. There's no question these are part of the project costs.
And the 2A, the redesign of the site work, it's a small number, it's 6,000.
It's the engineering component to redesign the Vortec and mechanical drainage system, and the $69,000 is the physical construction of it. And in the tree logging and milling, we got this dollars from Bruce Spayman, and he contacted a couple of people upstate Connecticut that would, if you go over there, you'll see 10 of them on the left-hand side stacked up. That's where he wanted them. He picked the trees that he wanted to mill and log, and we have them there. And then as soon as I can direct them to come down and get them and mill them.
Okay. Do you
So
members-
they're not related to they're a result of us running out of contingency. That we know is going to be future costs, but the tree warden thing is a much bigger cost in the future, as we mentioned to you previously.
Okay, Mrs. Tarkington and then Mr. Pellegrino.
Yes, I think there was a Greenwich Time July 22nd article in terms of the cost of the special mechanical drainage system. And I think you said at that time you expected the cost to be $40,000 to $50,000, and that also that the building committee would take those extra funds out of the contingency fund. So actually, I had emailed Bill Kelly, and Bill had said that that the proposal that we're seeing tonight would include the cost of this. So I was pleased to see it in there. I mean, he had advised that it would be there. Just so you understand that, Jim.
Mr. Pellegrino.
Just so I understand, on this item 2, wetlands drainage revisions, the appropriate time and the most efficient time to do this is when in the project?
Now, because we're clearing that area, we're
What area?
doing the parking.
This is the west area again?
No, it's the south.
Oh, this is the south area.
In other words, if you look at what we did originally with wetlands, was created a bioswale where a lot of this water was coming across the surface. And that would be a natural filtration before it went in. Now, that worked in some areas, but it didn't work here because what we found is a high water table and some, we weren't getting the percolation, whatever, here that we thought we were going to get here. So plus we had a lot of trees that we were cutting down here. So a combination of those two things made sense to change that. And so we agreed with that, and we agreed with wetlands, and we got our permit accordingly. But the problem is we ran out of contingency to pay for it, so we put it back into this.
Okay.
And also the tree logging that was done from this section over here, and if you go by there, all of the trees are stacked
Right.
right at the edge, so
Right.
we can take a look at them, so that we could haul those out of there.
Okay, and so in that south section, you're continuing to work there now as we speak, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because this area had no contamination,
Okay.
had a lot of rock, and we can get this done as
Sure.
well as this done, and that gives us a lot more
Okay.
parking.
Unless other people want to ask a question, but what is a Vortec unit?
My understanding is it's a method, I'll look at wetlands, I think it's a method of settling out any materials in it. In other words, the bioswale was that you had the water, the untreated, and this is all drainage water, has nothing to do with sewer, it's just drainage, surface drainage water. In the bioswale, you had an ability for it to settle in and be filtered naturally. In the Vortec unit, it actually comes into a tank and it's slowed down its velocity, the particles precipitate out, and then you take the water off the top of the tank. Now eventually, or periodically, not eventually, you have to clean those tanks, and DPW doesn't like the idea of that, but we all agreed that that's what we're going to do. We have a similar unit back here because we couldn't get the grades to work. Right over here, there's a large Vortec unit going in. We're supposed to go in, but we're not
Sure.
working back here.
Okay.
So the concept was approved on the site. We thought it was better to do the bioswale, we just couldn't get it to work.
Okay.
And the town engineer approved both, so we ended up doing this because it was what we needed.
Okay, thanks, Joe.
It's good timing, Mr. Chairman. I think, just so you know, we've just gone through items 2 and 3, the wetlands drainage revisions and the town of Greenwich, the tree logging and milling in the budget. I think members exhausted their questions on those 2 topics.
I just point out, Mr. Campbell, you did a very good job as chairman. Others in the state maybe should have paid attention.
For one brief moment, thank you.
Are there any questions then with respect to the topics that were discussed while I was talking to the town attorney?
Love to hear what happened.
Okay, so fair enough. So, the town attorney and I had a fairly lengthy conversation, and let's say that it remains unclear. Put 2 attorneys on the phone and stick a comptroller in the middle, and I'm not sure what you get from that. Certainly, there are a couple things that I can say that we agree on, and his opinion is as follows. Certainly, Section 28, even though it utilizes the word town, does not stand for the proposition that you would need to go through the normal channels, meaning Department, Board of Selectmen, potentially BET, and then RTM. If that was the case, you wouldn't need Section 28, and it would have no meaning or effect. But I think also equally important to recognize is that the drafters use the word town and not board, when in fact they use the term board later on in Section 28, and in fact say that the town may, on the recommendation of the Board of Estimate Taxation. So if town was synonymous with board, then why would the phrase upon the recommendation of the BET even be in there if the board could make the appropriation anyway? So then we talked about whether it could also mean whether it was the Board of Selectmen. And that might be the most reasonable approach or interpretation of this section, is that the Board of Selectmen is considered the town, and then upon our recommendation can then make the appropriation. And then we also discussed the fact that really only the BET makes appropriations. So when it says the town may make an appropriation, we really only have that authority, and that's confirmed then by the RTM subsequently. So at the end of the day, if we were to make an emergency appropriation, and the town attorney sort of approved this saying, there is a potential that we would be running afoul of Section 28. It's certainly open for interpretation. Certainly, we can make a strong argument that we can make an emergency appropriation, but it's not crystal clear. And so, I also, though, discussed with him the notion that could any amounts be considered operating out of the Board of Ed, and he did agree that that was permissible. So, all right. So, Mr. Raymer, a while ago you were going to make a motion, and I asked you to hold off. I've heard Mr. Simon wish to make a motion, but I said I would recognize you first. So, do you have a motion to make?
I stand on no pride of authorship. I don't know if Mr. Simon would rather make the motion. The motion I was poised to make was that I was going to move an appropriation of $1,163,000, and that would be handled as a release of condition out of the MISA funds, with the expectation that this body at a future time would address the question of how much would in fact be applied to MISA and how much would in fact be applied to a separate appropriation to be approved later on.
So I'm gonna call that motion out of order, only to the extent that you're putting conditions on a motion that really what's before us is the amount and whether or not we're releasing the condition.
Then I'll truncate the motion to be a motion for $1,163,000 of release of condition out of MISA funds.
Is there a second? Second by Mr. Finger. Discussion.
May I start the discussion, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Do I have a wrong number, Mr. Chairman?
Well, you're just taking item 1. There's 2 and 3. I was not here for discussion, so I must admit, based on that, based on your number, my assumption was either you were not addressing 2 and 3, or as a body you had decided not to approve the release. So I took it on face value.
I'm prepared to restate the motion yet again. And if somebody has a calculator, I'd be grateful if they would take $1,390,000, add 100, and deduct 152, which is to say deduct 52,000 from that, which would be $1,338,000.
All right, so let me make this simple. You've moved to release
$1,338,000 to lift the condition and allow that release of MISA funds.
That's been moved, and Mr. Finger, do you consent? Okay. So it's been moved and seconded. Mr. Raymer, discussion.
One or two quick points. I honestly think that there's a lively discussion to be had on the application of funds back and forth in and out of MISA. And I think we can have that discussion, and it's a better discussion to have over a period of weeks and months, and we can deal with this thing later on. But for the time being, I think this is work that we need to get done, and I think this is a way in which to get that work done. And for that purpose, I'm making the motion that I'm making. I certainly strongly disagree with the suggestion of the chair earlier that this is equivalent to bedrock found as a field condition. I think this is a remediation that would have had to have been done even if there was no MISA at whatever point it would have been discovered, and that MISA only, in fact, adds a small sum to it. But I want to not have that conversation tonight. I want to stand simply on the dollars that are involved, and so for that purpose, I'm proposing that motion.
Mr. Simon?
I have no comments.
Further discussion? I will say I have no intention of removing these funds from MISA. It's an allocable cost, and to the extent it does come up, I'm sure we will debate it. It'll come up most likely in September yet again when we'll have a further discussion on further release of funds to the extent that you're seeking additional funds, or in fact there's any delay as a result of what we find out on the fields. And we'll have that discussion in February and probably again in September, and then in October. And then,
sounds right.
It'll most definitely happen again in February for the 12-13 budget. So to be continued, I guess. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. What are we, 10?
Yes.
10-0-0. Okay. Is there any other further business to attend to? Hearing none, we stand adjourned. Thank you all for coming.